Bob Allies is a founding partner of Allies and Morrison, which has been instrumental in the delivery of many of the opportunity areas featured in the NLA's Changing Face of London exhibition. These include King's Cross, Olympic Site and Legacy, Greenwich Peninsula, Wood Wharf, as well as Canada Water. So Bob, can we go back to 2005 and sort of try and recall how you were thinking as a practice about the significant growth and change that lay ahead?
Yeah, it's interesting. We, in 2005, I think the practice was almost exactly 20 years old. And I think for the first 15 years, we were pretty much acting as architects with commissions for individual buildings. And then in around 2000, and then sort of very much by 2005, we were noticing a kind of change in focus and scale of the projects. We started working on the BBC Media Village at White City. We were working on Bankside 1, 2 and 3, the Land Securities Project, Southwark. We'd started in the Festival Hall in the South Bank. And then we got the commissions for Brent Cross Cricklewood as a master plan, and also King's Cross, also around 2000. So suddenly we found ourselves not thinking about individual buildings, but about groups of buildings. We started thinking about, I suppose, about the spaces in between buildings, and we started thinking about how cities worked and how through these larger projects you could contribute to that. And then, of course, also the Olympics came along in 2003 when we started working with Jason Pryor and with Edor at the bid stage with the aim of obtaining a planning approval by the time the decision was made in 2005. And I suppose the other kind of couple of things that were happening from our point of view at the time were that, I suppose, as we worked on these larger projects, we also began to realize that with these sorts of projects, the way you frame the planning application itself had to evolve, and how we would find the sort of balance between fixity and flexibility, and how you had to communicate those. So in a way, even the sort of output from the practice was changing from designing things to thinking about illustrating these sorts of issues, fixity, flexibility, in the documentation we produce. So the nature of the practice was changing. And then the last sort of two things, I suppose, seemed significant. One is that I remember how much we began on the master plan project, like Brent Cross Cricklewood, where when we presented it beyond the local authority, we were talking to the Government Office for London, was then the source of our response. And so essentially we were dealing with a kind of organization that was really in the kind of role of oversight, it felt at the time, checking what was happening. And then suddenly within those few years to move to the GLA and to begin to move to an organization which was taking the initiative in terms of the urban future. And that, I think that did feel at the time like quite a big shift. And I suppose the last thing, in a way, from our particular perspective, was that we bought our little site on Southwark Street and built our office building and moved into it in 2003, and then saw happening around us a kind of extraordinary transformation of a piece of sort of neglected, semi-derelict city, really. And so, and became sort of sensitive, really, to how that, why and how that was happening. In particular, two ways in particular, really. One was that, of course, it didn't have a master plan, so that was very interesting. But also recognizing in the end, there were these government initiatives like the Jubilee Line station at Southwark, like the Thames Link and the new Blackfriars station, like Tate Modern, the Millennium Bridge. And so even there, you could sense how when a government started to, or the government or the GLA began to invest in these sorts of projects, what a kind of motor that could put behind these sorts of these sorts of situations.
So clearly you delivered an awful lot of development over that period, yet there is a lot of blame put on the planning system about the inability to deliver for the growth required, and that's what's behind the radical changes in the planning system which are proposed now by the government. What's your view on those? And I think in particular, I guess, on the new form of local plans and design codes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, I'm sort of sympathetic to the idea that it's worthwhile rethinking the planning process. Not that I think it's incredibly flawed, but you know, there's no doubt it could be improved. So the kind of starting point, I think, is interesting, and I suppose, you know, what will play out is a kind of change in balance somehow between national government and local government. I mean, it seems as if national government wants to take more responsibility for directing some of these issues, which is kind of intriguing. But I suppose when at the moment, I'm not quite convinced. I suppose my instinct is to look at the sort of projects we've done and then imagine how they might happen through this new system. So, for example, if you took something like King's Cross, say, you know, would that be, you know, what category would that fall into? Would that be a growth area, a renewal area, or a protected area? You know, so that's an interesting decision, first of all, to make. And if, you know, however it proceeded, but certainly if it was a growth area, where, as I understand it, the developer would have the freedom to do really whatever they wanted, but it would have to be done in accordance effectively with a master plan and design guidelines, which would be prepared by the local authority. So, you know, then you ask yourself, well, what would those design guidelines have been like if Camden had produced them? What sort of, I mean, the words I think they use are popular and replicable typologies would they have suggested should be used? What sort of public spaces were they made? What sort of density would it have turned out to? And I suppose a big one for me is how much time could they possibly have spent on it? I mean, we spent about 8 years altogether, and which I think incidentally is a really good thing. You know, I don't think these sorts of projects should be rushed. I think their germination is a really important aspect of them, actually, that they allow so many layers of thinking to be put on them. So I can't see how that could really happen through a system like this. And I suppose the other thing which I feel is that, well, two other things really. One is that I think the interaction between, you know, private and public sector, developer and planner, new and old, isn't a kind of irritation. I think that's a really good stimulus to generating pieces of city. You know, I think it's a good thing to have those discussions and debates and arguments, and both sides to have a voice. So I think we'll miss that. And the other thing I suppose I feel is that, I mean, I'm not sure whether they're intending this or not, but what it comes over is a sense in which a desire to somehow replicate things as they are, that what exists is somehow the thing you should repeat. And I appreciate that change is often difficult for people, but I think change is absolutely fundamentally important to the life of a city. You know, I think things have to change. I also think that when we look back at what we have done from our perspective, nearly always we have argued for a different outcome than what was assumed by the local authority at the beginning of the process. In other words, you know, we've always gone counter to the existing assumptions. So it's odd to me that somehow those assumptions now might simply be the outcome. And you know, it may be that I'm misinterpreting it, or you know, not seeing the subtleties in the process that's described. But I am a bit concerned that there will be some losses in this, as well as, you know, clearly some gains.
Yes, well, local authorities have struggled in the past, haven't they, to deliver the sort of quality of place that you would see delivered in master planned areas like you've done in King's Cross, or indeed somewhere like Canary Wharf. So, I mean, if one looks, you know, there's a stark contrast between Canary Wharf and South Quay, two adjacent areas, but with markedly different outcomes. And that timescale thing is really fascinating, because the master plans do take a lot longer to deliver than where you have what we might call almost a free-for-all, where every separate developer is building their own site, often with less context than one would like.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, there are, you know, clearly some of these projects that we've been involved with rely upon a single developer having a, you know, gathering together a large land holding somewhere or another, and then being able to exert control over the whole thing. But there are lots of opportunity areas. I'm thinking White City and Elephant and Castle and Nine Elms and Old Kent Road now, where to achieve the outcome which the GLA is hoping for, while they have produced very often a planning framework that people are working with, they are relying on the sense in which different agencies or developers can come forward and work within that. So it is it is a challenge, and in those locations, the planning framework has been much more open-ended, if you like, than a master plan through an outline planning application might have been. I mean, I suppose we are probably we think it's possible for these things to work. I mean, a White City has been very interesting. We've been working with Stanhope. Well, actually, we've been working with three parties: Stanhope, Westfield, and Imperial. But obviously, the Berkeley Group are involved as well, and Stanhope on another project involved. And there has really been an attempt to kind of keep talking together. We've even produced a drawing to reflect everybody's schemes and bring them together as a way of dealing particularly with talking to people like TfL about the stations and so on. So I think that, you know, there are these moments where people do come together. And I think also, in a way, it's entirely feasible to have a successful piece of urban regeneration. I mean, I suppose Bankside again might be my example, where there's no plan, but somehow there's enough. I mean, maybe you know, we have enough context that people can respond to that, and that if people if people buy in, I suppose, to the kind of sense of the city as a continuum. In other words, the sense in which you need to find a sense of a continuous urban fabric. You need to find a continuous movement network. You know, you can't let that fragment. If people buy into that, then in a way people can keep knocking down buildings, building new ones, replacing them, and so on. And you can begin to build up, you know, a very interesting piece of city. So I don't think we would say that the kind of that the overarching master plan is essential. It gives you other sorts of opportunities, which somewhere like Bankside will never get. You know, it gives you unity, if you like, but I mean, diversity is interesting as well. So, you know, I think there are positive things that might come out of that way of working as well.
Thanks. Now, discussion about the 15-minute city seems to be gaining quite a lot of traction at the moment in the debate about changing shape of cities. What do you think of that as an idea for larger cities?
Yeah. I don't disagree with any of the aspirations or the strategies really that might come out of thinking like that. But I suppose I'm not quite convinced that it's provides the final answer, if you see what I mean. I mean, I'm not convinced that people won't always be prepared to travel further for employment. You know, I'm not convinced people will ever be prepared to work only to work within 15 minutes of where they live. I think that will all, you know, people will always go further if they think that will be more interesting. And I also think people are prepared to move their employment much more frequently than they're prepared to move their house. So again, I think there's a kind of another dynamic at play, really. And I suppose the cultural aspect of things is also very hard to satisfy in that way. You know, cultural activities of almost any kind require big audiences to be viable, and therefore, you know, it naturally tends to be difficult to provide locally, and tends to produce a different kind of structure for a city. But I mean, having said all that, of course, the issues of walkability and cyclability, which in a sense seem to be the kind of things which are being touched on at the moment, are fundamental anyway, and fundamental to the sort of city that I think is more likely, as indeed is density. You know, density, to get the 15-minute city to work, you probably can do it in Paris, where the density is as we know, very high. But it's always going to be much harder to achieve that as densities go down. So I think that's been, in a way, that's probably been another one of the most interesting aspects of the last 15 years, is that kind of is thinking again about density, which undoubtedly was a kind of dirty word when I first became an architect, and was assumed to be always carry a negative connotation. And now, you know, and we have been forced to rethink that, and you know, whether we're right, where we've ended up, I don't know, but it's certainly been it's been an important rebalancing, I think, in terms of the way we understand how cities operate.
So Allies and Morrison must have masterplanned more of London than any other practice. Have you totted up how many hectares you've transformed? What percentage of London have you masterplanned?
Funnily enough, I mean, before you mentioned that you might ask me a question a bit like this. So before doing that, the answer was no. But in having been asked it, I have tried to ferret around and produce some numbers. So we think we've probably worked on around 500 hectares of land in terms of planning, which includes about 50,000 homes, I think, altogether. And probably is an area, it's probably an area about the size of the West End, actually, just for curiosity. So these are quite big, you know, areas of city. And I mean, goodness knows how and why it's happened, and we've ended up doing it. You know, it's sort of, it's a curious phenomenon. I mean, the only thing I'm very sensitive to, actually, because, and I am very interested in the history of, you know, it's a kind of short history, but the history of planning and the way it's evolved in the you know, in the 20th century, is how often it goes wrong, actually. You know, I think when you look back, you know, it tends not to be a history of successes, it tends to be a history of failures. And so I'm very sensitive to that, you know. So however much, you know, I think it's important that we, you know, we keep looking and seeing how it works. You know, we need to kind of keep going back to these projects and investigating where they succeed and where they don't, because you know, success is never guaranteed. I mean, the only thing that I suppose we now can do is we can look at some of them. You know, we can look at King's Cross, we can look at the South Bank, we can look at Bankside. I suppose the other one I'm thinking of is Woolwich, actually, the Royal Arsenal, where you can begin to see places that are no longer building sites, but are beginning to kind of bed down as you know, new places, and you know, different sorts of places really than we're used to seeing. So it's a kind of slow process, now, watching things happen. But I mean, it has, in my mind, there's no doubt it has been an extraordinary period in London's history. It has been a transforming period, and I think, well, it's been, we're lucky in a way, all of us in our different ways, to have been able to participate in it.
Very good. Thank you, Bob. Well, you're very modest about your achievements. I was talking to Robert Evans not long ago, of course, who looked after the planning at King's Cross, and he was saying he finds little pieces on the site every now and then, which your team or you had insisted on that should happen. He couldn't see the point of it when it was proposed, but now he goes back, he realizes what the thinking was behind it. And I think that's a really interesting comment on the quality in delivering good environment. So Bob, thank you very much for your comments, and I look forward to meeting up with you physically sometime soon.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much, Peter. Thank you.